Mr. Enill, a very good morning to you, sir.
Good morning, Rennie. How are you?
I am doing better. Always good to see you.
Thank you, sir.
Look particularly rested this morning.
I am.
I think the idea was just to embarrass me. But it's good. It's good to have you here, sir. We've got a lot of things to talk about, so I'm going to dive right in. Before analysis and projections into next year, would you play doctor and I guess in the Trinidad vernac, see a man, as to what bitter medicine are imperatives in tomorrow's budget presentation?
I think that one has to, first of all, understand that 2018 is going to be a very interesting year. 2016 was a first in that it was the first year in which government revenues from energy disappeared. It virtually disappeared. 2 years before, it was 16 billion. On that particular year, I think it went to 844. In 2018, what will disappear, quite frankly, is government's ability to borrow. 2 days ago at a function, I heard that on the basis of our ability to borrow, that is to say, based on what the parliament had approved for the government, we are just about, we have an envelope of about $6 billion. So what that means is that insofar as borrowing to support expenditure is concerned, we are basically down to $6 billion. You got to put that into the context of what the Prime Minister has said. The Prime Minister has said that there is going to be a $18 billion deficit. So if it's going to be $18 billion, and the formula in the past has been borrow, sell assets, and do a couple of things, the first thing you know is that 18 could only be reduced on the borrowing side by 6. That gives you 12. Well, you could sell some stuff, and you could do a couple of things. But whatever you do, and I think we've seen where sale of stuff, sale of assets and so on will give you some resources. But in this kind of environment, I'm not sure. So let us assume that you can get another 4 billion if you can in selling something. Send LGC, send some part of FCB or something like that. And even that has its limitations. So let's take that off the table. We have to find a way, therefore, to fund, if you will, $12 billion worth of expenditure. And there are two ways you could do that. You can either increase revenue or you can reduce expenditure. So I think that in 2018, the government has found itself in a situation where it now must do what it has not done before. It must reduce expenditure and at the same time increase revenue.
Does that sound close to BIR and more for utilities and other services?
To a very large extent, the possibilities are endless. What I think is not known is what percentage borrowings and what percentage expenditure reduction and what percentage revenue increase. If the government goes 50-50, then you have some kind of indication that they're going to bring the expenditure into balance with revenue by that methodology. If, on the other hand, they choose 90-10, then more expenditure, less revenue, more expenditure. So there are a number of permutations that the government can look at. If the government's stated position is, and I think the Prime Minister have said that, is to maintain jobs, then it means that the expenditure will stay, and therefore what we can expect, if that is the objective, I think you're going to get an increase, possibly in taxes, a reduction in subsidies. In fact, what I expect is that the cost of living will in fact increase.
The cost of living increasing is one thing, but I want to stay into that area of finding ways to generate more revenue. The area of generating revenue is part of what you described there. The other one, of course, is controlling expenses. I'll come to that secondly. But the area of generating more revenue. We know that we have Wassa losing 17% of their water, according to the new minister. That is a big leak. We also know there is a leak that may be greater than that as to what taxes should be collected that have not been collected. incomes, the BIR, Board of Inland Revenue, we were hoping, my little layman understanding, from the finance minister's pronouncements earlier, that we would have had a more aggressive BIR and, as such, a greater attempt to stop the leak.
Well,
and that is a way of generating more revenue.
Well, so there are two levels of leak. There's a level of leak as it relates to collections. So there are lots of people that are not paying their taxes. But there's another level of leak by using intellectual knowledge to, in fact, arrange your affairs in such a way that you minimize the impact. And that is not illegal. But certainly if you are looking at ways to increase taxation efficiency, you may want to look at that, because those institutions that have the ability to do that, if you look at the numbers that they are posting, they are in a position to bear more of the burden of adjustment than maybe some of the others who are less skilled to so do. And therefore, I think that, one of the things that we have to be careful of in the society is that we make the burden of adjustment greatest to those who can least afford it. That's really not a society in which equity exists. I think that the situation has to be that those who can least afford it must be protected, because they are the vulnerables in our society, and we have to be aware that during this difficult time, the level of adjustment that they have to make is greater, therefore you need to cushion that.
You were saying that we have to rein in the deduction of the so-called 1%ers. And if not the 1%ers, certainly of those who are more endowed, better endowed financially.
Well, let me put it this way. So let me put the 1%ers into context. There are four ways in which you raise income in any society. One is as an employee, one is as a self-employed individual, one is as a business owner, or one as an investor. On the left side of that equation, you actually trade hours for dollars, and on the other side, dollars work for you. On the right side of that equation, there is room, a lot of room, to take a lot more of the adjustment. On the left side, there is not a lot of room. So I think in redeploying the resources and in looking at who should do what, some of those considerations need to be taken into account. There are those who can afford a little bit more, and it wouldn't hurt them as much as those who are currently living almost day to day. You interfere with their cost, and then the entire life goes in a different direction.
The voice you're hearing is that of Conrad Enill. You know him as a former Minister of Energy, also Minister in the Ministry of Finance, the government of Trinidad and Tobago, but you may not have known that he also held positions as former Governor of the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. We are fortunate to have him here this morning. We are talking about what we are to expect tomorrow. Thus far, we looked at the revenue side of it. Let's talk about what the Prime Minister described, and I think I am accurate if I recall. He said the biggest expenditure to the government, wages, which is the public service. At some point, when you speak in terms of balancing your revenue as against your liability, which is that recurrent expenditure, it has to be, the bull has to be taken by the horn in some form or the other. We know there's a moratorium until the end of the year, but come next year, we don't know what it says. Speak to me if you believe thus far the government has done a good job at controlling and reducing expenditure.
When I look at the numbers and I look at what has occurred, I think the government has done a fairly good job. Because up until now, I have not seen in Trinidad and Tobago what took place, for example, when circumstances were similar in other countries. In Dominica, for example, in Barbados, for example. When faced with similar circumstances, the results were disastrous in terms of people and in terms of the destruction of people's lives as a result of basically removing from them income that is normally used to treat with their family and so on. So in that sense, I think that the government has done well. I think that this conversation is one-sided. If you look at the government today and you look at the organization and you look at in this century how we are managing, we are managing very inefficiently. We are managing, in a sense, almost as though we're in the 19th century. But we are managing in the 19th century when we have tools of the future. To a very large extent, we are still very much in a place society rather than a space society. What that means, for example, is that our infrastructure is not developed to give us the maximum benefit, and therefore, I would prefer if the government does not look at reducing people cost, but look at creating avenues for people to express themselves and earn income commensurate with the investment that you have placed in them. In other words, I do not believe that we should reduce employee cost. I think what we should do is put the infrastructure in place to maximize their ability to do good work. And of course, if they don't, then there are penalties for that. But I think that that's a step that you have to go forward before you arbitrarily say that, hello, the cost is too high, let me get rid of it. Because what you will in fact be doing on the basis of the economics is you're going to get rid of your brightest people because they're going to cost you the least because they would have come in the earliest. And therefore the model would not produce that which you want.
So the money that has been invested in higher education, which is something that we have here, compared to other countries. The money that's been invested in higher education, along with creating opportunities for initiative, you believe is going to be the balance between dismissing people to control your expenditure and generating more revenue, basically, is what you're saying.
Yeah, I think that we have the capacity to do better. I think we have the capacity to increase productivity. I think we have the capacity to do lots of stuff. I do not think, however, we have in some instances the right people in place to lead that process because they're ill-equipped. And quite frankly, the context in which they see the world and the context in which they grow up is irrelevant to what we have to treat with today.
No, just that we don't take this as an ageist issue here. You are not saying there is a mindset of a particular governing age group. You are basically saying that people are into a school that blinds them to innovation in the world and new practices. Is that what you're saying?
Let me give you an example of what I mean. So a couple of years ago, real example, technology was being used at the time to manage your calendar. So I think at that point in time, we were looking at the Microsoft Office suite with Outlook and Mail and Calendar and those kind of things. So in a sense, therefore,
yes.
I could have in fact go on my device. It wasn't as integrated as it is now, and we were just talking about it. I can go on my device. I can basically put all my appointments there. I can sync it across a number of different devices, and a number of different people can get it. So that's what I understood. So I got into government, and I was told by my support staff that they understand technology very well. So I said, great, I will download this for you, and you would sync it. And they said, no problem. And then they printed it out and went to write down in the little book all the things that we had printed it out. And the question was, well, why are you doing that? Well, that's the system. The point I'm making, therefore, is that even as technology is being used, and even as technology is being embraced, and even as we say we are teaching people to use technology and so on, the systems that we hold people accountable for has not changed.
Yeah.
And I don't know how we expect that they would actually change it. They don't have the ability to change it. That's not their remit. So there's a lot that has to do with the intelligentsia of ensuring that the systems are responsive, and you cannot do that with the same persons who have created it.
We have spoken repeatedly, I have, on the issue of retooling people and this constant need for people to update upgrade their skill level, because what you're talking about there, half of the problems you have is you may have folks individually who are technologically savvy. However, if you cannot put something on a server that folks can make input to in real time, and then we can pull it back, we have to wait until we get this input, and then go into the question of adjusting a simple document, we are losing a lot of time.
Rennie, that's one reality, but there's another reality, and it's this. When I went to Singapore a couple of years ago, one of the things that struck me was this. The government sector has a particular remit. Mm-hmm. And in a real sense, the government sector is successful if it doesn't change anything. And the reason for that is because it's basically based on rules. It's rules based. It's the legislation says that you have to do this, you have to get 3 codes, you have to do this kind of thing. It really doesn't matter about quality. But some of the systems that were set up for the time now. Let me give you an example of something we have to treat with in 2018 that I hope government is looking at. As head of a financial services sector, because of factor and other kinds of things that affect the country, and by virtue of if you don't follow it, you would be de-risked as a country, and therefore you wouldn't be able to do business with the rest of the world, you have new regulations being imposed on institutions. You have compliance that used to be the big thing. Well, compliance is no longer the big thing. The big thing now is risk. Mm-hmm. And as you go into a risk environment in 2018, and there is the imposition of a new standard called IFRS 9, which basically says that you have to look at risks futuristically and apply provisions for it now, it means that the entire way in which you do business will change. Mm-hmm. The entire cost structure of business will change. And your ability to stay as a successful business will only happen if you understand how to manage that going forward. Here's the issue. If all you've been doing all the time is what you know, there's no way you could be successful because you can't bring to the table an experience. Mm-hmm. The point I was making about Singapore is that in the Singapore experience, what has made them good is that the private sector and the public service interchanges their resources, because in both instances, the salary considerations are the same. Mm. So if I move from the public sector to the private sector, I have no loss in salary.
It's horizontal.
That is not the case in our model. And therefore, when we start talking about those experiences or those countries without understanding the underlying philosophy that makes it work, it will only be a consideration for talk. It really must be that you understand specifically the technical pieces of why it works, understand it, and then implement it. So that's the point I was making.
We speak of managers making it. I understand what you're saying, because one of the arguments that's been proffered in the oil industry, for instance, is because if you don't have the people making comparable money as they do in other parts of the world, they will not stay with you, and you will keep getting people who are filling a space because they are affordable. And that doesn't get you anywhere. We are talking this morning to Mr. Conrad Enill. He is the holder of an MBA from the Brunch University and Henley Management College, as well as an oil and gas mini MBA, continuing professional development certification from the CW School of Energy Limited, and a certified Caribbean and USA Credit Union Development Educator from the World Council of Credit Union. We are talking about the budget that's coming up tomorrow. The area of subsidies is something that I believe will factor in tomorrow. I don't know if you share that, but if you look around and see that we are still paying a whole lot less for electricity, if we look around and see that the gas that keeps electricity to everybody is subsidized, sold to power gen at a subsidized cost. If you look at the situation with water and a lot of the utilities that we have, we are paying way less for it, and as such, if you're paying way less, you have abuse and or wastage. Now, do you see the issue of subsidies? I just did the trickle down effect of it. So let's stay at the very top. Subsidies. You believe that is something going to be dealt with tomorrow?
The first thing that, yes, I think it has to be dealt with, because I just think we don't have the resources in place to deal with it. But I think that there's a more fundamental issue that the country has to come to terms with before you get into a deeper discussion of it. And it's this. What is the role of policy in changing the behavior of a country? And let me give you an example. Mm-hmm. Many years ago, you had to go and line up at the licensing authority and bring your vehicle for inspection, and then they will give you a certification. Somebody thought that that was a terrible thing, and we got rid of that. And as a result of getting rid of that, we put the money into another space. So you can pay, go and get your vehicle tested by somebody and pay the fees, and they'll give you something for that. Mm-hmm. But what does that do to the behavior of individuals? What does that do in terms of your ability, your accountability, your responsibility in the context of this particular item? It has removed it. I can go and get it done, and yes, and to the extent that we have all these things in place, right? I get it signed off, I pay for it, and I move on. The deliberate activity of you having to sit down, of you having to make a conscious decision, of you having to know that there is an accountability in place, of you having to know that if you don't do it, there's a penalty for it. All of those things that had occurred as a result of this particular measure was removed, and therefore, as an individual, it has removed from you that accountability. A lot of the things that we have done in our society to make people's lives better have had, in some instances, the unintended consequences of removing the responsibility and the accountability from me and putting it somewhere else. I think that that is catching up with us, and I think that there needs to be a revisiting of how you use public policy to get the type of behaviors that you're looking for. If you have to do that, however, you have to understand that your institutions have to be more efficient, and you have to make sure that your institutions respond in a way that you don't create for people hardships. Those are the issues I think that the government needs to be talking to the population about, so that the population can understand that these things are required, because we are a society and we are a people that need some of those things to help us.
I am encouraged by your optimism that if you educate all, they will put in best practice. However, has that proven to be workable? One, and two, do we have the luxury of that slow educating process in the context of the subsidies we talk?
See, I've heard that, and I've heard about best practice, and I keep saying that when you go to another society and you tell me that best practice is as a result of what they have done, I don't understand that. Trinidad and Tobago has its own unique culture. It has its own unique set of problems. It has its own unique circumstances, and therefore best practice for me is what we determine that to be, not somebody else. If you look at our situation with the energy sector, for example, and whether people accept it or not, our energy sector is one of the better ones in the world, because we've been able to get a certain amount of revenue from it that has impacted the country in a particular way. And when the history is written, we would start to understand exactly how good we are. But let me make the point this way. In the case of our energy sector, when we are doing a project, our best practice works like this. We actually define the project. We look for the people in the world who have done this project successfully. And then we go to them and we say to them, we would want you to assist us to achieve a particular objective. Now that basically flies in the face of those who would say to us, well, you have to give everybody a chance. You have to do all this. You have to do it. In a society that is made up the way we are, that doesn't have the level of resources that we have, that have in many instances specialized resources who need to get on with the results that you're looking for, we have at some point in time to start to trust ourselves. At some point in time, we have to stop behaving as if everybody in the country is a crook. That is not so. There are people who are very much interested in a different quality of life because they understand that they have a responsibility. They were blessed with certain attributes and they have done well, and that for us to all live in a society that makes sense, and for us to live in a society that is developed, there are some rules we have to play by. And one of the things we have to do is to stop talking ourselves as if we have no value. We do have value. When I was in energy, for example, I would go around the world, and every time I go around the world, I'll be very proud to see a Trinidadian, because usually a Trinidadian will be flying the flag, and you would hear very, very good things about a Trinidadian. I was in Qatar, and they were telling me how great Trinidadians were, helping them develop some of the most innovative responses to problems in the world. So we do have people that have skill sets.
Conrad Enill is our guest this morning. We are talking all the way up to the 12 o'clock hour about the budget that's coming up tomorrow, in addition to a couple of things that really we must do. There are many who would say that you can. It's almost like the law. You put a penalty there not only to penalize people for behavior, but to deter them from some behavior. Some argue you can do that. The same thing with policy. And if not so, I ask you, Mr. Imbert, Mr. Imbert, I'm already on to the finance minister. Mr. Enill, I look at the question that policy is going to have to deal with this proclivity we have of we must import this, we must have that, we must have that, we must have that. A lot of money is spent importing things that we don't really need, and some will argue with Trinidad and Tobago, man, we should have it. We have grown accustomed to it. But you were talking about water and a whole lot of things that we import that we should not be importing. That's costing us a whole lot of money that we don't have. Foreign exchange I'm talking about.
Well, so let's talk context. In Barbados a couple of years ago, in talking with the Minister of Finance at the time, looking at taxation on credit unions, because he felt that he had run out of resources, and I was saying to him that doesn't make sense. But that wasn't the issue. The issue is that he was saying to me how happy he was that he had 2 weeks of import cover. So, we have 11 months. So what are we talking about in terms of hardships and those kind of issues? We don't have that. We've seen countries that basically operate with a lot less than we have, and they've done so successfully. So it's really not a situation of us not having. It's really a situation of us recognizing the realities, the reality of the day, the recognition that the lifestyle that we had grown accustomed to was very much paid for by oil and gas. And while there is going to be an increase in production this year, possibly next year, and in 2020 as well, as a result of new productive activity on stream, the reality is that capital allowances, which is perfectly allowable under the law, will now eat into any additional revenues that the companies will get, and therefore the government will not benefit from it very much. It is not going to benefit from it on the basis of revenue from taxation, but it will benefit on the basis of additional foreign exchange. So there is going to be additional foreign exchange coming into the system. There's not going to be additional revenue. But, who are we comparing ourselves to?
Yeah, but you can legislate behavior. I mean, that's the way I think about it, because if, in fact, folks think they should have apples year-round, we should have water, money to import water. But if I put limits on and I put a filter on your ability to just go and import everything, then I'm beginning to control, one, the amount of foreign exchange that's leaving the country, and I'm beginning to ask you to look within.
Well, yeah, absolutely correct. I mean, there are some vehicles that the government has imposed a 45% purchase tax on, duty tax on. What it means is that fewer people will purchase that type of vehicle, and it means that the government will get the benefit from those who can afford it. That's a policy. There's absolutely nothing wrong with that policy, because what it seeks to do is two things. It seeks to move consumption in a particular direction, that is to say, away from large vehicles, because the majority of individuals may not be in a position to purchase it, but those who wish to purchase it will pay for it. So policy has the... Let me give you a policy that is misunderstood even today by some of those who are in the political space. When we took the decision as part of an administration some time ago to pay for any Trinidad and Tobago citizen who would have found an opportunity somewhere to study, it was a very much criticized policy, because there were those that felt that you should have some skin in the game, and therefore it doesn't work that way. And the traditional thinking was that you have to decide what the country is going to be looking for, and you train people for those kinds of things.
Well, you speak specifically during the Manning era.
During the Manning era.
Please.
Well, quite frankly, we had that in place already. Because what the ministries would have done is that they would have had a tranche of money available to them to develop capacity for the future. So if they wanted geoscience, if they wanted accountants, if they wanted lawyers, they had resources for that. But we were not talking about that. We were talking beyond that. Beyond that. So, for example, a Trinidadian today wanting to study geoscience, wanting to study aeronautical engineering. I'm sure today, if we look at the people who have been successful as a result of accessing gate opportunities, you'd find a number of people in areas of study that we have absolutely no use for in Trinidad and Tobago, but however, it has placed them in a global space. And therefore, the revenue earned from being in that space will allow them to make sure that their families in Trinidad and Tobago in particular, are taken care of,
live well,
which reduces the impact that the government has to play on those citizens. So I think that going forward in Trinidad and Tobago, we have to recognize that we live very much in the global era. And some of the things that are happening, we cannot stop it. One of the things that happens, for example, is that people come to Trinidad and Tobago, or people study in Trinidad and Tobago, and then they leave. You can't stop them from leaving, because there are opportunities all parts of the world that they actually take. And these opportunities translate into revenue, and these revenues translate into better quality of lives, and it translates into removing that particular family from poverty, which is the objective that we have.
You say that you no longer singularly, you look at it, but no longer singularly look at brain drain as you looked at it before.
Absolutely not, because we live in a different space.
It is 20 minutes away from the top of the hour. 12 o'clock, Conrad Enill is my guest, former Minister of Energy and Energy Industry, Minister in the Ministry of Finance. We are talking about the budget coming tomorrow. According to the last mid-year review, there are 3 highlighted areas I want to go through. I want to go through them individually with you. One, there was great revenue anticipation from property tax amidst the politicizing and challenges in court. How seriously has the delay in that collection affected revenue expectation?
I think that it would have impacted the government's ability to do certain things, but to the extent that the government had other areas available to it, it would have mitigated any impact. So a Minister of Finance has available to him a number of tools for revenue shortfall or for making up revenue challenges. So, for example, he has the ability to, in some instances, just don't pay. Just don't pay it. So instead of paying you because I just don't pay you. So that's one. 2, he also has the ability to use treasury bills in some instances to make some payments. So we will make those payments and then we will do it. He also has the ability to go to the central bank and draw down on balances. So there's a lot of tools that the minister has that is available to him that he can use in order to meet those issues. However, it means that the results that he was looking for, the results that he was looking for may be compromised. So if he was looking for a particular deficit, that deficit may increase. So not being able to collect the revenues or not collecting the revenues when it is due is a problem. It means that he has to make choices about which expenses he will not commit to.
Second point here, for the second budget presentation, there will be talk of improved tax collection, of course, through the BIR, yet to be fully put in place. We keep hearing about the BIR, it is not put in place. Should a renewed call from the or commitment or articulated intent of the Minister of Finance for us to collect more revenue through a BIR be treated with wary minds from the citizenry? Do you think we are closer to be actually putting this in place, or do we have more training and more steps to put in place before we can really talk about collecting this money?
There are two issues with the whole discussion on revenue collection. The first issue about it is that there seems to be a view that we are not collecting efficiently. Okay, so let's park that up for a minute. But the second and more fundamental issue is that in Trinidad and Tobago, revenue collection between customs and excise and the border inland revenue at this point in time is disconnected. And therefore, you can be owing at the level of customs significant resources for bringing in goods and all those kinds of issues. So, and at the same time, you can be getting money from the state at the level of the border inland revenue. The thinking on the Revenue Authority was to be able to bring these agencies together and to be able to use intelligence to look at where your challenges were, and in a sense to ensure that those who are involved in the activities, legitimate activities of trade, would be able, through the state, to pay what is rightfully expected. If that can occur almost overnight, I think that you are going to get a significant amount of additional revenue, because there is leakage as a result of the left hand not understanding what the right hand is doing. So when we talk revenue collections and we talk an increase in revenue, more efficiencies, we are not only talking about collection in terms of cash flow payments, we are also talking about a change to the system that allows for more to occur.
Third part of the three questions I told you that's burning in my head is the one of the gaming industry. Everyone concedes that this industry, recreational industry, should be taxed for a number of reasons. It is an ongoing business, and it should be taxed too, invariably because of addiction and lack of people saving because they're gambling their money away. Some argue that it in fact costs money from the state in the long run, but essentially at the crux of it is an ongoing business and it should be taxed. There is consensus it should be taxed. What can you make clear to us this morning is the problem, why we are having this long discussion on something that has proven in other parts of the world to be ABC?
I think that I will leave that question for when you have the current minister coming here to talk to you, because that is really a question of enforcement. And, this is an issue that has been around for a very long time. I remember when I was in government, we passed a piece of legislation and then we didn't carry through on it. But really and truly, it was intended to make the whole slot machine activity, which is where some of the activities occur, and the conversions, we were planning to make that a prohibited entry into the society. And that never went through for various reasons. But it is an issue, but it really requires, I think, the government to be clear about it. Because one of the things that you have to recognize, that there is a significant amount of people, we've allowed it to move so far, that there is a significant amount of people who actually earn their living from this industry. And therefore, you have to be mindful of what that is going to do with the lives of these individuals, because they are citizens. So you have to find a mechanism that allows for getting the good in the industry, because there are some places around the world where the industry works and it's regulated in a particular way, and it contributes in a particular way.
You say, I will let you have that question for the current minister when he gets you. You are saying that in fact there is no argument why we should not be collecting this money. Am I correct?
No, I think that we collect the money from time to time, but I think that there has to be, in my view, a way in which the state, through all its agencies, are on the same page. The license for opening one of these entities is basically with the legal system, and then the enforcement is with the other system, and then so you have 3 or 4 systems, and these systems at any point in time operate independently. In the independent operation of their particular areas, you may have a result that may not be in the best interest of everybody. I think you have to work through that from that perspective.
Conrad Enill is my guest. Do you believe that in the 2018 365 days we have there that the government will follow through with the new version of the Trinidad and Tobago Revenue Authority?
I don't think so, because I think that for that to occur, there are a couple of things that should have been in place already. The first of all is that they would have needed to have an agreement with the opposition for the passage of special legislation, because it will require special legislation because of a particular there is a particular benefit that customs currently has that basically allows them free entry to any part of Trinidad and Tobago at any point in time. If you have to change that legislation, you would need a 3/5 majority, I think, and therefore you would need the opposition. So if you're moving that element of it as well into the Revenue Authority, then you would need to have the opposition on your side, and I don't see that as something that has been discussed. The second issue is that you have to deal with the concerns that the union has, and the concerns that the unions have are quite legitimate, but at the same time, the concerns that the government has are also very legitimate. And therefore, one has to sit down with both those groups and really come to terms with what is in the best interest of Trinidad and Tobago. And I do not see that conversation as having happened as yet, and therefore I don't see it. So I wish the parties very well, but I don't see it.
We're always going to have that problem, that issue of two rights going on at the same time. I want to go into something you said earlier, because I think it begs clarity, lest some leave with the impression that it is not as bad as it is. You speak of a new reality, which you say is what we have to deal with. You say that the sky is not exactly falling, we just have to manage the movement of the clouds, as it were. Continuing the analogy. Many will say that if the sky is not falling, then maybe the unions are not being as unrealistic as some choose to think, because in their view, at least some views articulated, there is still more to be extracted from the exchequer via increased wages and so on, particularly in the public service. In the area also of government control or owned industries, the argument is also that retrenchment will not be allowed, and you cannot ask workers to stay at the same wages and salaries they had before, so they will be asking too for their pound of flesh if there is not the clarity that we are, some aspects, the sky is indeed falling.
So let me clarify that.
Yeah, because you made, let me just complete it for a moment, because you made the point, when we talk about that revenue shortfall, it is a reality.
Yes.
Please.
There are two very interesting dynamics that we need to understand in the context of Trinidad and Tobago, and certainly in the context of government. The first one is government's role as an employer, if you will, or as a business. The second one is government as the individuals who, by policy, create circumstances for the rest of the society to live. So on the one hand, the budget and the budget numbers reflect the expenditure that the government is committed to and how it proposes to meet those commitments. Mm-hmm. In that situation, it has to deal with public officers. It has to deal with transfers and subsidies. It has to deal with social benefits. It has to deal with debt repayment. As a business, the government's business is basically, I have a level of expenditure of 54 billion. I have revenues from the rest of the country of 38. I have a gap. How do I fund it? So that's the business of government. But government is not the only business. we have a significant private sector. We have a significant energy sector. We have a significant financial services sector. We have a significant tourism sector. And therefore, in many instances, some of those sectors, organized properly, incentivized appropriately, can in fact boost government's revenue, which would allow government the ability to meet its expenditure. And once it does that, the strain that the country is under at this point in time will be reduced. Depending on how you manage that, you are either going to get positive or negative responses. I think the problem that I see is that nobody wishes to tackle the issues. Nobody wishes to make the adjustments. And everybody believes that we can continue without intervening. We have to intervene. And that's the point that I make around the issue of, we have choices. We have choices. We could choose how we want to do that. If we don't, we could do absolutely nothing. And we can talk about it and continue about it, and the rest of the world is going to pass us. And one of these days we're going to say, well, oh my God, we had these opportunities.
Or maybe, as the Prime Minister said, we can do nothing and just pave our way to the IMF.
We could do that too, and we will get there eventually. But we can actually take action. One has to think about, for example, some years ago when the NER was in government and they actually lost an election because they took action. But as a result of that action, many have seen a different Trinidad and Tobago exist because of those actions. Yes, it was at the time bad, and a lot of people suffered, and a lot of things occurred, but the sacrifice that was made then resulted in a better society, and a society that for years was able to manage in such a way that everything was okay. I think the time has come for us to once again relook at where we are and take some action.
Talk show host malfeasance I may be accused of if I let that little slip you put in there a moment ago, the IMF, and we will eventually get there, you said?
If you do absolutely nothing, because the IMF comes in when you are unable to pay your foreign exchange bills. We have 11 months still, and I mean, if we do absolutely nothing and use it out in 11 months, then on the 12th month they'll be here.
We can keep pulling down on the stabilization fund.
That is
for the purpose of some of the things you mentioned a while ago, creating opportunities, giving funding one or recurrent expenditure to some extent because you're stabilizing the economy, but also in creating avenues for us to increase that revenue influx, or you disagree with that?
So a couple of things. The first one is that I think that going forward, there's a better way to use the Heritage and Stabilization Fund. I would argue that I would take all the energy resources and put it in the Heritage and Stabilization Fund.
Would you separate them?
No.
No, why not?
Because there's no need to. The Heritage and Stabilization Fund was never intended to be used, When we set it up and we looked at the Ryder-Scott report, the Ryder-Scott report basically told us that on the basis of current production within the energy sector, you had about 13 years of reserves available to you. What that meant, therefore, was that if you managed your economy well, that is to say, if you manage within your revenue stream, there will really be no need to touch the Heritage and Stabilization Fund. On that basis, therefore, it was simply a pool of resources. And the way that it was intended was that you would build up sufficient capital assets over time so that at some point in time, the interest earned on those assets would be able to replace any revenue that you'd be getting from the oil companies. What would have happened, therefore, is that you would have moved the revenue mix in the country from being revenue-based from hydrocarbon to be revenue-based from financial assets. That was the plan. And in those circumstances, therefore, it really never was intended to be used. Because the Minister of Finance, I said, continues to have available to him a lot of other instruments before you touch the Heritage and Stabilization Fund. In our particular circumstances, the government had to touch it, not simply because of the conditions, but because of the U.S. condition. Remember that we had a precipitous drop in revenues from U.S. based U.S. based revenues, and therefore you needed some of that in order to stabilize, but you didn't have to use that. The other thing about the Heritage and Stabilization Fund is that it cushions your ratings, because when the international agencies look at your Heritage and Stabilization Fund, they believe that if you borrow, you have the ability to repay, and therefore they cost the debt and they cost your country
more favorably.
Yes, yes.
I've got 3 minutes with me, and I've got 2 questions I must throw at you. As my guest, and I'm really, really happy to have him here, Conrad Enill, the former governor of the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, former minister in the Ministry of Finance, and former minister of Energy and Energy Industries. I'm going to ask you for the way forward for Trinidad and Tobago, the way you see it. How would you recommend some of these strategies we need to deal with our current situation be approached? One, identify them as a 1, 2, 3 primary areas, and what we need to do to get there.
First of all, I think that I would argue that the government should actually go through and deal with some of the suggestions that have come up. You know, we have a number of very learned individuals who from academia make these very interesting policy prescriptions. But I would argue that the government has a lot of information, and there's a lot of gaps in the education of some of these individuals, because when you really sit in government, you really have to look at people, and you really have to understand how you are impacting people's lives. Once you put that into the equation, then the technical arguments, as sound as they are, may be inhumane. And you need to tell people that, yes, we could reduce costs, but then what happens to our people? And then that conversation, in my view, creates the opportunity for a gap that we currently have in the Caribbean. We do not have information about what we need to be doing as a society based on our own experiences. We take external parties' experiences, we bring it here, and we say because it worked there, and we still work here. And I'm saying that that's not the way where we create new knowledge. And in a sense, therefore, I'm saying that what needs to happen now is more explanation. We need to bring more people into the decision-making process by giving them more information, so that they could understand some of the choices that you have to make.
One of the points you made earlier in conclusion is that we have not been impacted, as we have seen other countries face with similar shortage in revenue. We've not been hit with some of their problems in Barbados. When they got the budget speech and I told them about more taxes, they got to the streets. Trinidad and Tobago's Minister of Finance said before, we have not squeezed our people. That's not our intention. They have not hit the streets. Do you anticipate anything close to draconian coming out of the budget that will let some people walk around holding their heads and screaming?
You know, I have a lot of respect for the people of Trinidad and Tobago, and I think that the people of Trinidad and Tobago, by and large, understand the issues if you tell them the truth. I also think that there are sufficient agencies out there for people to independently make a view. And I think that once they understand what the issues are and they understand the choices that you have made, and they see it as something that is positively impacting, I don't think you're going to find much disfavor.
It is not idly said, the more I listen to you, the smarter I get. Conrad Enill, thank you so much for taking the time to be with us this morning. As always, we will see what comes of this budget speech tomorrow, and I hope that your phone is still available for me to dial after it, because I am sure we will have areas of continuing this conversation.
Thank you, sir.
It is always a pleasure. Thank you so very much.